for management training, for leadership development, to really help them launch their careers in a meaningful way. There's some who really want to be at recognized brands, whether that's a startup or whether that's a company like PepsiCo that is a place that they know. The thing that I hear more consistently than an interest in startups is that they want to be somewhere to make a difference. They want to be somewhere that they can do good in the world, that they can do something that feels meaningful and that matters to them.
No, that makes a ton of sense. And again, I guess part of the challenge is them figuring out what that role is.
Absolutely.
I mean, Patrick, I mean, you're at PepsiCo, which is probably one of the most well-known brands and most established companies in the world. I mean, are you finding that PepsiCo's brand and history is a positive or negative in your recruiting process, and how do you leverage that or overcome it, respectively?
It's a great question, Jeffrey. I think in general, we find that the brand is a positive, particularly as we tell the story about all of the brands under the PepsiCo umbrella, from, iconic brands like Pepsi itself and Lay's and Doritos to Quaker Oats and Gatorade. There's a huge number of brands. We have over $21 billion brands. So I think there's many things that people can identify with, a place of comfort, like Lori said, that, hey, I understand what that is and I kind of understand what it stands for. We kind of span the spectrum of food and beverage, from, good for you products to fun for you products. And I'm happy to sell them all. I think our job as PepsiCo is to offer consumers a choice. And when we kind of lay that out for students, they're pretty excited typically about being part of that. I think one thing that can distinguish you aside from your brands is your culture. And here's what I'd say is that's more attractive to students if they feel connectivity to the organization, if they can see themselves being successful there. That, as they get to understand companies, is probably a better indicator of where there's going to be fit and fulfillment.
But how do you, for the student that thinks he or she wants to go do something innovative or wants to go work at the sexy startup, how do you overcome that? How do you help them recognize that Pepsi has a great culture and there is a ton of innovation going on? How do you get through that when taking that first job or even that summer internship is or perceived as so high risk for the student?
I think a couple of things. You need to make sure that they get enough chance to interact with the people who are on the team, particularly folks who are close to their age. I think when people describe their experiences and the things they get to work on, they can see in that environment, whether we're working on a new product line or we're developing some new process, that there's a lot of innovation that has to go on, even with an established company like PepsiCo, and that some of the aspects that they might be looking for in a startup, and also just telling what people do on a day-to-day basis, because for a lot of folks, they may not have worked in an organization previously, or not one of size or outside the university or kind of hometown scope. So understanding what it is that people do and why they like their jobs and how they find fulfillment, to me, is incredibly important in creating the attractiveness. Now, there's some people who are still always going to want to go to something that feels like it's the front edge, the leading edge of where commerce is going today. And for those people, we wish them all the best. They may not be the greatest fit. We encourage them to pursue their dreams. But we find we do not have an issue with attractiveness on campus because we're established. I think that if you tell the story correctly and you interface folks with a great cross-section of your associates, then you're going to be successful in your recruiting endeavors.
No, that makes a ton of sense. And if we think about it, the other side, I mean, the other hot topic right now is the so-called skills gap. And again, Lori's heard me pontificate about the fact that I don't think there is a skills gap, but that's a different conversation. I mean, Patrick, do you see it that way? Are you, with Pepsi's brand and with as you said, lack of challenge recruiting on campus, are you finding that college students are well prepared for their first job? And if not, what are they missing? And if so, sort of what's the media getting wrong?
You know, I think the skill gap knowledge or the skill gap question is a bit overblown in some respects. What I expect you to come out of school with is a demonstrated ability to learn. Your organization is largely going to teach you many of the technical skills about how it does what it does. What is much harder for me to teach you if you don't come in with the skills are the leadership skills, the influence skills, the ability to communicate with people, particularly those who are different from you, and in some cases vastly different from you. Those are things that you learn a little bit in the classroom and a lot outside the classroom if you're taking advantage of your time being at school, whether it's being in the workplace at college or university, or engaging in student clubs, activities, organizations. All of those give people a chance to interact with others, to have leadership positions, to be confronted with difficult situations and have to work through adversity. Yes, that happens in the classroom too, but there's something about the social skills part of it that really separates those who will be most successful from everybody else.
Learning how to learn is a key one, and it's something, Lori, I know you've brought up a lot, specifically with regard to liberal arts students. I mean, Patrick talked about some of the lessons in the class or out of the classroom. I mean, are there things that you're seeing Purdue or other schools do really well around honing those skills or really ensuring that the students can communicate those skills effectively to employers?
Well, I think there's always more that we can do to help students communicate them more effectively. But I think, you know, I wish that all of our recruiters on campus were as open-minded about the kinds of students who can be interesting for their companies as Patrick is. I think that there's still too many people out there who sort of don't read a lot further than what a student's major is and decide that they know who the student is and what they've learned and what they do or don't have to offer. And so, you know, so you read these articles all the time with employers talking about, they say soft skills, I say core skills, that students are missing in terms of communication and creative thinking and problem solving. But a lot of those are the same people who have a student come through a job fair with a major in philosophy who's doing 6 extracurriculars and is deeply involved on campus, may have a job on the side, but they sort of get hung up because they think that there still is too much belief that what a student's major is defines what their career can be. And I think that we know that that's not true. I think that after a first job, it doesn't matter anymore, but I think it is a barrier of entry to too many students, and finding ways to get people to look beyond that is an important thing that we still need to do.
No, and again, it's so well said, especially when you look at the NACE and other surveys highlighting that the top 10 skills, north of 80% of them are things that are not technical. It's communication, problem solving, analytical thinking. Very few of them are technical, but again, the data shows that 55% of new hires coming out of college are going to leave their first job within the first year. So it's well and good that they have communication skills and problem solving. But do you worry, Lori, that companies just aren't going to be as willing to invest in the more tactical training of those students if they don't have the coding skills or the Excel skills?
Well, I think that for all of our students, for example, finding a way to walk in with some level of digital literacy is key. That may mean that they have skills in data analysis. It may mean that they can work their way backwards and forwards on a spreadsheet. It may mean that they've done some basic coding. I think that it's incumbent upon our students to do that. And I think it's a way in which Purdue is uniquely positioned as with its liberal arts college, because students are here in the context of so much STEM opportunity that they can choose to participate in. But, you know, when it comes to training, and I think this maybe gets at a different issue, I don't think that it's a realistic expectation for employers that we are going to turn out graduates who can walk in day one and work exactly the way that they want them to, because every company is going to be different. And, you know, and we aren't offering tactical training for a student to walk in the door at PepsiCo and understand how PepsiCo works, right? It's exactly what Patrick said. We're preparing them to walk into PepsiCo and have PepsiCo be able to pull them into their corporate culture and understand their ways of doing business. And I think that's an important difference that we need to help people understand about what should and shouldn't be expected out of higher education.
Yeah, and Patrick, I mean, again, to Lori's point, you recognize those value propositions, but we know there's often friction between HR and hiring managers. That as much as you recognize the value of learning how to learn and analytical thinking and problem solving, how do you help your hiring managers recognize what Lori just said, that someone can come in and add value even if they don't know Pepsi inside out day one, and that it's worth investing in them, and that they should look beyond, again, just the business school student with a 3.9 from a certain school? How do you overcome that pushback? Or does it not exist at Pepsi?
No, it exists. I think it exists with every human being. And that the first thing that people usually look for is something that looks a lot like themselves. And so, number one, it starts with making sure that you have a diverse team of recruiting professionals who can go and represent a variety of disciplines, and also have a very direct talk with them in advance about what you're looking for. And exactly what you said, I believe, Jeffrey, and say, hey, of the top 10 things that make you successful in the workplace, very few of them have to do with your degree. They have much more to do with your desire. And making certain that you frame up and get the state of mind correct for people. Remind them of the fact of the importance of having a workforce that, you know, thinks differently, that can challenge one another in constructive and positive ways, that brings us to a different level of thinking, that lets us see things in a different way, is so much more valuable than a workforce that's going to do it the way we've always done it. And having that conversation, and having it even right before you go into the recruiting season, is pretty important, because it can help reframe people's minds. But you're always going to sort of try to have to resist the bias that people have of successful people look like people of success, and many of those may look the same to them.
Yeah, I mean, Amazon found that out the hard way recently with its AI effort that got stopped because it was being tuned based upon prior employees. And again, prior employees all sort of look the same. And it's not just something obviously facing Amazon, but a larger issue around AI and predictive hiring. We got some questions beforehand about, I guess, tactical strategies to do that. So as much as you go to a hiring manager and say, hey, I met this amazing individual from Purdue, liberal arts, but he or she has a different background or a different major or a different GPA, and hiring manager, again, continues to push back. Are there any tactical strategies or approaches you've used to overcome it at that point when you're not able to sort of nip it in the bud before the recruiting process begins? Or is it that you just have to deal with it beforehand?
Well, I think you have to be able to do both. You have to be able to work in the moment. Some of it's going to be based on the credibility that you built in the organization as an HR professional, demonstrating that you make good calls on talent. But there are also logical arguments to be made in terms of, okay, well, let's take a look at what their background is and what have they accomplished? What is the output that they've created? So I always really think it's important to get out of the theoretical and into the actual and the practical, and say, here are the things they have accomplished. Take those accomplishments and stack them up against your other candidates. Don't worry about the path they chose to get there. Worry more about where they arrived. I think that's more valuable to frame it up that way, because at the end of the day, managers need to be worried about what outcomes they're creating within the organization. And if you can help them see things in a different way, maybe through a different set of lenses, I think that's a practical way to try to bring a different person into it. And then, to the extent you have a good executive sponsor for a particular school, trying to get them to influence the hiring managers is one other way, particularly if you have them bought into the notion that we're looking for the very best talent, irrespective of background.
No, and it's again, that makes a ton of sense, especially given your focus on diversity and being such a thought leader in that space. I mean, Lori, in the same way, we were hearing about schools trying to do everything they can to support first generation or non-traditional students or students from other backgrounds. And I know what Purdue liberal arts has over 20% of the students who are again, non-traditional or first generation. Are there different things you're doing, whether it's through the Liberal Arts Career Center or in general, to help them best position themselves to employers and help employers that may not be as enlightened as Pepsi see the benefits of hiring them?
Well, I think one of the things that is the most difficult for those students is that they come in with a different set of social capital. And I think that, at the end of the day, it makes an incredibly large difference who you're connected to and who you know when you're trying to get that first internship and when you're trying to get that first job. And so a part of what we're doing is trying to create the opportunities for all of our students to make those connections, to build their own personal network. And so we create Career Center programming on a variety of topics, on working in HR, on working for nonprofits, on being an entrepreneur. But on all of those, we bring in a panel of people, generally alumni, sometimes other business leaders, but mostly alumni, so that students can connect with them, so that they can begin to build their own LinkedIn profile. They can create their own network so that when they're at the point that they're looking for that internship or talking about that first job, they have people that they can connect with. There's a class that I teach called LA Influentials. It's a 1-credit class, and every Friday we bring a different alumnus to campus so that students can hear from them. And so they hear from people from all of the majors that they're pursuing who've had these really interesting careers, and every so often one of them might be linear, but often they really move in a lot of interesting directions. And it's helpful for the students to hear that. But the other thing that I think is really helpful is we've created opportunities for the students to then interact with those alumni in smaller group settings, through a coffee or through a lunch where there might be 6 or 8 people around a table. And the other part of what we're trying to do there is to help these students who may be first generation college students who are sitting at a table with the Chief Human Resource Officer from PepsiCo, and to be able to understand, okay, that's a really scary title, but Patrick's a really nice guy, and he went to Purdue, and I've got this thing in common with him, and I can talk to him about these things, and I can build a relationship. And so trying to help them get more comfortable talking with people who can be great connections for them is an important piece of what I want to accomplish as well.
Oh, and that's a huge point. I mean, I used to talk about the fact that I would get calls from students in Indiana that would give me tell me about a typical day, or let's talk about Indiana basketball, and they're artificial questions. And as much as I want to try to support Indiana students, they're not particularly interesting for me. They're not particularly interesting for them. So really forming ways to drive that interaction more authentically is pretty powerful. I have a bunch of other questions, but we got a number from the audience before the webinar begins. So let me hit you with a couple of those, if that's okay. One of the questions, and again, Patrick, I'll direct this at you, though it sounds like PepsiCo doesn't have that issue, so Lori, feel free to chime in. Info sessions and career fairs don't seem to be working with student attendance low. How are employers responding to this, and what seems to be the trend to replace them?
Yeah, I wouldn't say we don't have that issue. I think the way that students interact today is different. We see that in our media consumption. Let's face it, it's not just students, it's all of us interact differently. Our time is under incredible pressure, and there's so many things competing for it. So I think you have to have things that supplement career fairs. I think you still have to have opportunities for students to interact with employees in real ways. To me, that is really important. And they can go maybe log on and listen to some spiel or watch a video that we might give at a career fair that helps them understand who we are, what our brands are, what our values are, and how the company operates. That's usually helpful for students as they begin making choices. I often find they want to get to know what we stand for, who we are, who these people are. And so having opportunities for them to interact with our, in many cases, recent alumni. Now, in some cases, they may not be from that particular university or school because we recruit at many schools. But in the case of Purdue, we do something we call Cooking with PepsiCo, which is just a very easy social gathering. And we, because Purdue is a large enough school, we're able to bring in a chef from our facility in Chicago to talk about how you can use the various ingredients from the foods that we make to create different appetizers and drinks. And so it's simply a venue to create interaction. And we try to pour as many of our associates into that as possible so that every interested student has the opportunity to interface with someone and that they can find people with whom they might make a connection and better evaluate whether we're the right employer for them. You know, like I say, I think we're a great company to work for. I've been here for a long time, but we're not going to be right for everybody. So having that time to make personal contacts, to understand a little bit about what the organization is and the kind of work we do, that to me is still something students look for. Beyond that, you've got to have social media interaction. You've got to have websites where people can find things out. You have to have forms of information. And I think you have to use a multi-method approach to how you interact with students on campus today.
No, that's really helpful. And actually, we got a couple of questions about video profiles that companies are using, and it's great to hear how they're part of it, but obviously they're not a complete solution. Lori, anything you're seeing? I mean, obviously Patrick has a great perspective on PepsiCo, but you're seeing companies of all shapes and sizes. Any best practices you're seeing?
I think that what Patrick's saying about creating opportunities that allow students to engage are really important. So students are interested in things like the videos. This is a group of students who have been watching YouTube for as long as they can remember. But when it comes to where they're going to be from 8 to 5 or 9 to 5, they really want to understand the people and they really want to feel comfortable with the people. So I think having more people who are likely to be interacting with them or maybe part of their cohort is an important component. As I'm talking to some students now who are weighing job offers, they're sort of talking about how it felt when they were there, how it felt when they talked to people, and kind of what that interaction suggests about what the opportunity is for them. So I think that's really, really important for these kids.
Yeah. No, and that aligns to some of the things we're hearing. And when you think about all of these different processes, another question that came up was around timelines. What are some of the best timelines to get involved in campus recruiting, and how you think about those given they seem to be going earlier and earlier in the year and limited to just once or twice a year? Any way that you think about it, Patrick, or trends you're seeing, Lori?
Well, from my perspective, we are one of the companies that tries to come early because we are a large geographically distributed enterprise and we have a pretty big campus target to hit every year. So I need to be looking at, as we go through the fall, how are we progressing against that campus target? So we have activities that will start as early as the end of August and key interviewing happening at the end of September and beginning of October typically. My advice is to, the biggest competition amongst employers is clearly going on in the fall. And then the spring is used for topping off. You know, how did you do against your original targets and how many more folks do you need to fill that? So in some ways the spring is a lot more selective because the slates are not as deep for the talent that you need to fill. So my advice is when you get there, either for your internship, back to school that fall, have your resume ready and use the time during during the first part of the semester to get it tuned up, and then get out there right away and engage, because there will be a slew of employers that hit the campus in September and October.
And we have folks from both big companies and smaller companies on the line, and one of the things we're hearing from folks from smaller companies is that's all well and good if you're Pepsi and you sort of have an idea of how many people you need, and by the way, if you hire one or two too many, it's no big deal, or at least that's the perception. Lori, I mean, what are you seeing smaller companies doing? How are they overcoming that barrier, or are they just not able to?
Well, I think that, so we have students who are going to companies like PepsiCo, going to larger places that are doing fall hiring, but we also have a lot of students who sort of know that they are going to be hired to fill an immediate business need. And that's going to happen later. There's students who want to work for smaller companies. There's students who want to work for not-for-profits of one kind or another, whether they're arts related or philanthropically related. And so, you know, we have students who I wish had done more in the fall, but who sort of think that their opportunity space doesn't start until spring semester, because they know that they aren't going to be hired that many months in advance, because a company can't afford to keep a position open that long, right? With some of these smaller organizations. And so I think we see a little bit of both. I wish we could get more of our students engaged earlier, even if they do think that they're interested in a different kind of experience, so that they could go through the process, they could understand the opportunities in front of them, and they could, you know, even if it's mostly getting the practice, because really they're going to hold out for, you know, the small theater company that's where they want to work, or the museum that's where they want to work, or the social service agency, that we could get them into a little bit earlier recruiting space.
Well, and it's interesting, both of you talked about recruiting earlier, and we're talking over the season from a seasonal perspective or calendar perspective, but obviously another hot button issue is the fact that career services needs to begin and career exploration needs to begin freshman and certainly no later than sophomore year. In fact, one career services leader made a comment to me that if a student's coming in senior year, she knows they have a problem. How are you thinking about that? I mean, are there things you're doing, Lori, to get the students involved earlier? And Patrick, are there things Pepsi's thinking about to start building those relationships freshman or sophomore year of college?
So for us, in terms of the way our student services are structured, we have an undergraduate recruitment and career advancement team. So the group of people who are working on those two issues have a team approach to doing that. So even in our recruitment process, we're talking with prospective students about career opportunities here. We're working to get them into the LA Influentials class earlier. We're creating exploration programming for freshmen and sophomores to think about what they're doing. And we're really talking about the way that things like internships can be very additive, that, you know, a student who does an internship during the summer between their first and second year can build on that to have a better internship between their sophomore and junior, and a better internship between their junior and senior year, and really grow during that process in terms of their experiences, their skills, and their career exploration. And so we're trying to encourage more of our students to think about finding some sort of opportunity, whether it's the kind of thing Parker Dewey offers with project-based work, or whether it's a full internship, but really doing that as early as they can in the process, to find what they love and to find that thing that they absolutely don't want to spend doing for the rest of their lives early is an important thing to know.
Oh, yeah. I mean, I couldn't. Oh, sorry. Go ahead, Patrick.
I was just going to say, I totally agree with Lori. The earlier people begin engaging in understanding what the world of work has to offer is going to really help shape them. And I think it's not that easy, particularly when you're a freshman. There's so many things that you don't know. One of the ways that we try to do it is through clubs, organizations, and the cultural centers on campus to find ways to show up in students' lives other than at the Career Center, because sometimes that feels like, well, that's later in my academic career that I'm going to have to engage with Career Center. So part of it for me about creating a strong pipeline of future talent is to show up in spaces where the students are going to be anyway, and offering something to them in terms of sharing our experience, supporting an activity, doing whatever we might, so that we can begin having that dialogue. And, you know, in some cases, that dialogue is going to reveal that that particular individual never wants to work for PepsiCo, for instance. They want to do something particularly entrepreneurial. They want to go into social services. They want to do something altruistic. Helping them on that journey of exploration is really important. And that's said as someone who did not figure that they wanted to come into human resources until 3 days before I interviewed for the job. So I will stand by my own hypocrisy there.
No, I completely agree. Again, I did my summer internship at Coopers and Lybrand back when it existed, and I knew the first week I didn't want to be an accountant. And I went back to school 10 weeks later with one data point of one thing I didn't want to do, or at least didn't think I wanted to do. I had no context. And when you think about it, again, back to the earlier comment about being 55% job hopping within the first year, coupled with the fact we're north of, I don't know, 40 or 50% on or underemployment of reading college grads, doesn't sound like we have a job shortage or a candidate shortage. It sounds like there's a matching shortage. And there's this limited opportunity for both sides to do enough exploration beforehand. So your points are great. Just a couple more questions and then we'll wrap up here. One of the questions that came up was, please review the effective platforms on social media to reach college recruits. Are there things that Pepsi's doing to, again, use social or otherwise to engage the college students and what's working and what's not? Anything you can share, other things you're seeing, Lori?
You know, I think it is a place that students are looking, but I think that the place that works the best is peer-to-peer, is what they're hearing from other students. So whether it's because they are, they're going to career fairs, they're participating in a class, they've met an alum, I think they hear the most from one another, and I think they give it the most weight.
Yeah, that makes sense. Patrick, anything Pepsi's doing, any secret sauces you can share with the folks on the call?
This is where I really wish I had my campus manager, Sarah Rode, on the call with me in terms of her experience with which platforms were the most effective. I do think, for one, people are going to go to your website, particularly if you have a jobs website, and that needs to be easy for them to navigate as a campus hire. I don't know what grade I would give us there, but I would say we should be testing out different ways of accessing people all the time, because there's a lot of different channels that people use. There's a lot of channel fragmentation today, frankly. So I think that's just simply a way of getting people interested in your brand a little bit. The payoff is exactly what Lori said. People got to meet you and get to size you up a little bit eye to eye to see if you're the kind of organization they want to work on or work for based on the people whom you've hired.
Got it. That's helpful. And again, two more questions, and I promise we'll be done, since I think we're actually running over. So thanks to everyone for sticking around with us. Question that came up quite a bit is with an increasing focus on applicant tracking systems and screening tools and all of these filtering tools, I think they called them. How can students better tell their stories? And in particular, adults and non-traditional students, but overall, how can any suggestions for how students can get through those systems, especially those that may not have the highest GPA or come from a focused school? How do they get into Pepsi, or what can they be doing to best position themselves?
I think they have to have demonstrated leadership, activities that they've engaged in, demonstration of where they have done more on campus than simply attend their classes, and whether they have a great GPA or an average one. I think they need to be leaning into here's how I made a difference, and here's how I participated in the environment that I was given, particularly at your more traditional campuses and universities. I'd say at our non-traditional campuses and universities where you see more commuter students, we'll be looking for a stronger work performance to see how people had to, enrich themselves as they went through their collegiate experience.
I think, to build off of that, in terms of telling stories better, I think first students have to spend time figuring out what it is. They have to spend time thinking about what their unique skills are, understanding what the various extracurricular, study abroad, co-curricular activities they've done on campus really mean, and how do they translate as skills. I think they need to think about what their personal values are and create a story that is authentic and memorable. I think when you think about adult learners and non-traditional students, they've got a built-in differentiator across the spectrum, right? When you're looking at a lot of 22 and 23-year-olds who are graduating. So what does it mean to have gone back to school as a non-traditional student? I think that people feel like, I think they spend too much time trying to tell a story they think someone wants to hear, instead of trying to tell a story that's authentic, that they don't recognize yet, that people are going to be delighted to hear.
Oh yeah, and you completely agree. And you brought up the point before about, I can remember if you used this term, crosswalks. It's helping the students understand the crosswalks between what did they learn in philosophy class and why does an employer care? And how is that going to help that employer, that prospective employer, perform? So it's the research and communication and problem solving. Okay, so last question, and Lori, we'll start with you. One piece of advice you would share to a recruiter on the line, so a company side, and one piece of advice you would share to one of your peers on the university side.
So I think it's the same piece of advice, and I think it is that there's a language disconnect. And I think that students don't always understand how to articulate their skills for employers. I think that I often tell students, I don't care why this job is going to be good for you. You need to talk about why you're going to be good for the company. And so I think, students have spent 4 years on campus where we are doing for them, trying to help them learn, trying to help them grow, trying to help them develop as leaders. And so it's a big pivot for the student to recognize, okay, I need to talk about what I have to offer now. I'm giving now. I've been taking, but I'm getting ready to give. And I think that's really important. I think for companies that, especially when we think about things like these core skills, that they don't always do a very good job of articulating really what they need. I think when, if I could look at 15 job descriptions for a whole spectrum of jobs, they would all say that they needed someone with strong communication skills. But I think what is meant in terms of communication skills for someone who might go into a PR role versus someone who might go into a human resources role or a recruiting role or a sales role, they aren't exactly the same thing. And yet sort of they default into these words that work nicely in the applicant tracking systems, but may not really call down to what it is that they're actually looking for. And so, so I think that when companies can better articulate what their roles really require, that it will be easier for them to identify the prospective talent that aligns best with those roles.
Yes. I could not agree anymore. Patrick, what's your one piece of advice on both sides? And no cheating like Lori did using the same piece.
Yeah.
No, you can cheat if you want.
As much as I'd like to cheat, I'm ill prepared to, let's put it that way. I have no crib notes. Listen, for students, you do need to understand a little bit about what your story is, as we've said before, what it is you do want, but as Lori said, you got to talk about what you can offer, what your outcomes and what you've done. And you have to think about what part of your story doesn't come across on a resume. Because a resume is a one-page reflection of you, and you are a lot more than one page. So what is in there about the experiences you've had in life that have been shaping and forming that you are somehow going to bring into that dialogue. And for employers, it's about the open-mindedness that you have to equip your recruiters with to really pull out of people who are the people who've had the truly great experiences. Don't rest on that resume. Which of these people have done amazing things in their own right to come to the front of the line? And that, as Lori described so well before, it's often not reflected in the field of study that they've had. So those are my 2 pieces of advice.
No, that's great advice. There's a great chart somewhere on our website. I'm happy to send it along to anyone who wants, that shows the alignment of major to career path. And long story short, it's a complete mess, because the takeaway is, it doesn't matter what your major is. I mean, Lori, you've said it before that your philosophy students are looking for roles at companies and they don't see any job title of philosopher. I mean, maybe Google has it, but otherwise no one else does. And how do they understand that and communicate it and get in the door? With that, I know we were supposed to only be a half hour. Thank you so much, Patrick and Lori, and to all of the folks who joined us for overstaying by 50% plus of our time. I really, really appreciate it. I know we'll send around information on the webinar for folks who want to listen afterwards, and we'll send around some notes. But Patrick and Lori, thank you. We really appreciate it. And there's so many great pieces of advice you shared. So thank you again. Thanks to everyone for joining, and enjoy the rest of what's hopefully not too cold of a week like it is up here in Chicago. Take care.
Thanks so much. Bye-bye.